So folks, I saw a recent video that THP put out. It was talking about muscle architecture adaptations. Now this is related to some of the content I've been making recently. In fact, those adaptations they were talking about, I actually briefly mentioned in one of my recent videos. And I had some people send me this video asking questions about it. I saw some comments from people saying they were confused by it, didn't understand it. So yeah, I don't know if the subject matter was really well suited for a conversation. You know, THP did this for their podcast, so I get that's why they did it that way. Yeah, it was not planned out material, and so it maybe didn't come through real clear. I don't know if they really delivered the message. So I'm gonna basically redo it and try to help some people understand it better. So first, we just got to cover some anatomy, okay? So I have this excellent drawing here. This is a tendon. This is a muscle, a whole muscle. Okay, this is a cross section of the muscle. Within that, you have smaller subdivisions called muscle fascicles. Okay, that's this grid in here. All right. Now, a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. Okay, so from a fascicle, you have muscle fibers. All right, and a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. So that's when you're down at the cellular level. Okay, so then if we look at a cross section of the muscle fiber, in there you would find a bunch of myofibrils, okay, which are these contractile chains of protein, all right, that run the length of the muscle fiber. And so then each myofibril is composed of a chain of sarcomeres. That is this thing which I covered in a recent video. Go back and watch my length-tension relationship video if you want some more education on that. But it's the myofibril is a chain of sarcomeres. The sarcomere is where we have these protein filaments that line up, they overlap, and they form myosin-actin cross bridges, and that's where you get muscle tension generated, okay? So this is a sarcomere. A whole chain of those, like thousands of those, is what makes up a myofibril. And then there's a bunch of those myofibrils in a muscle fiber. So in their video, Ben and John were talking about basically two forms of hypertrophy or muscle growth. That is adding sarcomeres in series and adding sarcomeres in parallel. All right. So adding sarcomeres in series means that in this chain of sarcomeres, the myofibril, you're just adding more links to the chain. So that was the drawing with the squares, right? Where you have like side by side myofibrils, okay, and the little squares are sarcomeres, and then adding sarcomeres in series means you're just putting more sarcomeres in the chain of each myofibril. All right. Now, what this adaptation achieves, two things. One, it increases your fiber shortening velocity, okay? Because if each sarcomere is shortening at a given velocity, if you have more sarcomeres shortening at that velocity, the total chain then is going to shorten at a higher velocity because those velocities are summed up, okay? So increasing contraction velocity. The other thing this helps with is producing force over a broader range of motion. Okay, if you think back to the active tension curve of sarcomeres, where it looks something like that. Okay, so you have sort of this peak in the active tension. If you have more sarcomeres, then you can stay closer to this peak operating range in more sarcomeres at more different ranges of motion. And the other adaptation is adding sarcomeres in parallel. So that's talking about packing more myofibrils into a fiber. So if you have the cross section of a muscle fiber and you have, you know, all these myofibrils in there, then adding sarcomeres in parallel is like adding more myofibrils, more protein contractile chains in that fiber, okay? And so that's just, you're just getting more protein chains in the muscle to generate force. And so that kind of has some obvious benefits there. So that was the drawing with the squares where, let's say you're starting out with these 2 myofibrils, right, and these 3 sarcomeres, and now instead of adding more sarcomeres, making the myofibrils longer, you're just adding another myofibril next to it. All right, so that's what the square drawing was about. Now for the tricky stuff, one of the things that happens when you add sarcomeres in parallel is you get a bulging of muscle fibers, and then they can change pennation angle. All right, so what does that mean? We have muscles like this where you have the line of action of the muscle is in parallel with the muscle fascicles and the muscle fibers. Okay, the biceps are an example of this. All right, it's pretty simple. And then we have what's called pennated muscles, and this is where you have a line of action of the muscle, but then the fascicles and the fibers are positioned at an angle to that. The quads, for example, are built like this. All right, and then we have like unipennate and multipennate and all these different types of muscles. Okay, but this is what pennation means: is this angle relative to the line of pull. An increase in pennation angle means the angle of the fibers and the fascicles is moving further away from parallel with the line of action of the muscle. And this tends to happen with increases in muscle thickness and cross-sectional area. Now, pennation angle is a tricky topic because increasing pennation angle feels negative, right? If I'm positioning fibers further from parallel with the line of action of the muscle, less of the force that they produce is going in the direction you want. All right, so that feels like not a good thing. But there's a few factors that sort of balance that out. Okay, so first of all, remember that this increase in pennation angle happens when you're hypertrophying the fibers. So they're getting more protein chains packed into them. They're gaining the ability to produce more force. And so that can balance out a little bit of a change in the angle. Also, there is architectural gearing ratio, which I'll try to keep it simple here. Basically, as the muscle shortens, the fibers rotate, okay? They rotate and shorten. But so that means that for a given amount of shortening of the whole muscle, the fibers actually don't have to shorten as much. And that means that for a given velocity of shortening of the muscle, the fibers don't have to shorten at as high of a velocity. And remember that shortening at a higher velocity means that the fibers produce less force. So if they're able to shorten at a lower velocity, that means they can produce more force at a given level of a given velocity of whole muscle shortening. Okay, so increasing pennation angle wouldn't necessarily increase the maximum shortening velocity of the muscle, or maybe it does. I'm a little hazy on that, but it would allow you to produce more force at a given shortening velocity. And keep in mind that from what we've learned about muscle tendon mechanics during explosive movements like jumping, the whole muscle shortening velocity may not necessarily have to be super high in order for you to jump really high. It's more about lengthening the tendon and then letting the tendon shorten really fast, whereas the muscle may be able to stay operating at those slower shortening velocities. And so increasing force at a given shortening velocity is a very important adaptation, a very relevant adaptation. Then also keep in mind that when the muscle is put under strain, like while it's producing a lot of force, things get yanked down. And so then the angle of those fascicles and those fibers does actually turn and get closer to parallel in those moments. And so there's a number of factors, again, that balance out sort of that instinctive negative impact of the increase in pennation angle. There's a number of variables that sort of outweigh that and show us that this is actually a positive thing to a degree, right? It is possible that at some point, you know, if they turn so far that they're like closer to perpendicular with the line of pull, that now sort of the inefficiency or the force not going in the right direction outweighs those other factors, and now it becomes a negative thing. So there is some theory that there might be some sort of optimum pennation angle, but we have not been able to identify that yet. Or, I mean, it's obviously like a super hard thing to do. It would probably vary depending on the person, vary depending on the specific activity that you're trying to optimize for. And so hard to make claims about that right now. But overall message is that increase in pennation angle, at least to some degree, is a good adaptation. And I think that might have been one of the key messages that Ben and John were trying to get across. I think historically, when it comes to training for explosive movements, there's been more of a focus on adding sarcomeres in series, as this is associated with the higher contraction velocities, right? And what I think they're trying to say is that's a positive adaptation, but also adding the sarcomeres in parallel, making the muscle fibers thicker, increasing pennation angle. This is also a positive adaptation, even for explosive performance, whereas maybe that was previously viewed as more of like a bodybuilding type of adaptation. So yeah, all that is a bit complicated. You got muscle architecture, you got different types of adaptations, you got the length tension curve coming into play, the force velocity curve coming into play. All right, but the big question is, what does it mean for training? Now, I would just say a simple message, like, you need to get strong in order to sprint fast, jump high, etc. And in the process of doing that, you should not be afraid to grow your muscles some, to get some hypertrophy, right? Meaning you shouldn't shy away from some volume in the weight room, shouldn't shy away from eating your protein, gaining some muscle, increasing your body weight a little bit, right? We can talk about differences between different activities and different athletes in regards to that. But just in general, you shouldn't be afraid to grow some muscles in the process of getting strong. And I think Ben and John were trying to say that as well, right? That's why they were talking about Isaiah's quads being really big, okay? Now, I personally would just stop the message there with that simple claim. There might be a little more to explore in this department when it comes to concentric versus eccentric strength training. And I think Ben was alluding to this towards the end of the video. He said, surf the whole force velocity curve, right? Which I'm just kind of reading in between the lines there, but typically when people talk about surfing the curve, they just show the concentric side of the curve. And I think when Ben said whole curve, he was talking about not just concentric, but the eccentric as well. And so he might be referring there to utilizing supramaximal eccentrics or forced eccentrics, forced lengthening of the muscle. This does seem to be a bit of a trend in his content, and John like posting, Isaiah doing the super heavy squat negatives and stuff. It seems to be like a thing they're sort of exploring right now. So I think that's what he was talking about. So, what's the deal with that? Is there some difference with concentric and eccentric strength training and the adaptations to those? Let's talk about that.